Sometimes the biggest mistake a person can make is believing they already know your story. The late afternoon sun hung low above Highway 17, turning the asphalt into a ribbon of gold stretching across the edge of the city. Heat shimmered above the pavement, while traffic moved steadily in both directions. Marcus Ellison drove with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel of his aging dark gray SUV. The vehicle was clean but ordinary, the kind of car thousands of people passed every day without a second glance. Country music played softly through the speakers. In the passenger seat sat a paper bag containing takeout food and a folder of documents he planned to review later that evening. It should have been an uneventful drive home. Then flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Marcus glanced up, checked the speedometer, and eased his vehicle onto the shoulder without hesitation. Gravel crackled beneath the tires as the SUV came to a stop. The traffic rushing past created a constant roar of wind and engine noise. Marcus lowered the music and placed both hands where they could be easily seen. He had done this before. Most drivers had. Yet something about the way the patrol vehicle stopped behind him made the air feel heavier. A second police cruiser arrived less than a minute later. Marcus noticed it through the side mirror. His expression remained calm, but he could feel the familiar tension settling across his shoulders. Two officers stepped out. The first was Officer Daniel Carter, a veteran patrolman known throughout the department for trusting his instincts. He adjusted his sunglasses and approached the driver's side with the confidence of a man who believed he could read people within seconds. The second officer remained near the patrol car, watching quietly. Daniel stopped beside the window and looked inside. His eyes moved from Marcus to the dashboard, then to the back seat. Marcus offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon, officer." Daniel did not return the greeting immediately. Instead, he studied Marcus for several seconds. Cars continued speeding past only a few feet away. The sunlight reflected sharply from the officers. "Badge." Finally, Daniel spoke. "Do you know why I stopped you today?" Marcus answered calmly. "No, sir, I do not." Daniel folded his arms. "That is interesting." The response felt less like a question and more like a judgment. Marcus remained composed. He had learned long ago that frustration rarely improved difficult situations. The second officer moved closer. Daniel glanced once more through the vehicle. "Where are you coming from?" Marcus answered politely. "From work." "And where exactly is that?" Marcus gave a brief answer. Daniel's expression did not change. The questions continued. Each one seemed slightly sharper than the last. Around them, traffic thundered down the highway beneath the fading sunlight. Drivers passing by slowed to look. Marcus could feel eyes on him from behind windshields. Yet he kept his voice steady. Daniel looked at him for another long moment before saying something that immediately changed the tone of the encounter. "You expect me to believe that?" The words hung in the warm evening air. Marcus looked at the officer calmly. Neither man realized that before the sun disappeared below the horizon, everything about this roadside stop would change. Marcus Ellison looked through the open window at Officer Daniel Carter and kept his expression calm. The question had not really been a question. Both men knew that. Traffic continued rushing past on Highway 17, carrying commuters home beneath a sky slowly turning orange and gold. The warm air smelled faintly of hot pavement and cut grass from a nearby field. Marcus rested his hands where they could be clearly seen and answered with the same steady tone he had used since the stop began. "I am telling you the truth, officer." Daniel studied him again. Something about Marcus seemed to bother him. Not because Marcus was aggressive. Not because he was disrespectful. In fact, it was the opposite. The more composed Marcus remained, the more suspicious Daniel appeared to become. The second officer moved closer to the SUV and glanced through the rear windows. There was nothing unusual inside. A few folders, a gym bag, a paper bag containing dinner. Ordinary items belonging to an ordinary man. Yet, Daniel continued asking questions. "What kind of work do you do?" Marcus answered politely. "Community development." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That sounds vague." Marcus nodded. "I help coordinate programs for families and local organizations." Daniel looked unconvinced. He glanced toward the second officer, who responded with a small shrug. The highway noise filled the silence between them. A large truck thundered past, briefly shaking the air. Marcus remained patient. He had encountered moments like this before. He understood how quickly assumptions could form. More importantly, he understood how rarely arguing changed them. Daniel took another step closer. How long have you owned this vehicle? Marcus answered. Then another question came. Then another. Each answer seemed only to generate more suspicion. Across the median, sunlight reflected from rows of moving cars like flashes of gold. Marcus could feel time stretching. What should have been a routine traffic stop was becoming something else. Several minutes passed. Then another patrol vehicle arrived. Marcus noticed it immediately in his side mirror. The flashing lights painted brief streaks of red and blue across the side of his SUV. His expression did not change, but his stomach tightened slightly. Daniel spoke into his radio. The words were too quiet for Marcus to hear clearly. The second officer began examining information on a tablet device. Neither man explained what they were looking for. Marcus watched the scene unfold without interruption. Inside the center console sat a folded family photograph. He thought about his daughter. He thought about the dinner growing cold in the passenger seat. Mostly, he thought about getting home. The evening light continued fading. Daniel finally lowered his radio and returned to the driver's window. You seem very relaxed. Marcus offered a faint smile. Being upset would not help either of us. For the first time, Daniel hesitated. The answer was reasonable, honest. Yet something kept him from letting the situation go. More cars passed. More minutes slipped away. The shoulder of the highway glowed beneath the setting sun. Marcus looked out toward the horizon and took a slow breath. He still had no idea why the stop had become so complicated. But somewhere beneath the growing tension, a feeling lingered that this long evening was only beginning. Officer Daniel Carter stepped away from the driver's window and walked back toward the patrol vehicles. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the shoulder of Highway 17. Marcus Ellison watched through his side mirror as the three officers gathered near the rear cruiser. Their conversation was impossible to hear over the steady rush of traffic, but their body language told its own story. Daniel spoke while pointing occasionally toward the SUV. The other officers listened, glanced toward Marcus, then looked back at their screens. Whatever they were searching for, they had not found it yet. Marcus leaned back against his seat and exhaled slowly. The paper bag holding his dinner remained untouched beside him. The food was probably cold by now. He checked the dashboard clock. Nearly half an hour had passed since the stop began. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Most drivers would have been home by now. Yet he remained parked on the side of the highway beneath flashing lights that painted the evening air red and blue. A fourth patrol vehicle arrived. Its lights joined the others, creating a long line of reflections across the passing traffic. Several drivers slowed as they passed. Some stared openly. Marcus knew what the scene looked like from the outside. For police vehicles, one man standing at the center of their attention. Assumptions formed quickly in situations like that. He had seen it happen before. Daniel returned a few minutes later. This time he removed his sunglasses and tucked them into his shirt pocket. His expression remained serious. Mr. Ellison, I need to ask a few more questions. Marcus nodded. All right. Daniel looked down at a small notebook. You said you work in community development. Yes. What organization? Marcus answered. Daniel wrote something down. How long have you been there? Marcus answered again. Every response was clear and direct. Yet the questions continued. The second officer moved around the SUV, looking through the windows once more. There was still nothing unusual to see. Marcus remained calm, but he could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier. The evening sky was beginning to darken. The first hints of sunset painted the western horizon in shades of orange and purple. Daniel studied him carefully. You are not angry. Marcus looked toward the distant horizon. Being angry would only make this longer. The answer seemed to catch Daniel off guard. For a brief moment, uncertainty crossed his face. Then it disappeared. Another radio crackled to life behind him. One of the officers listened closely before walking over to whisper something into Daniel's ear. Marcus noticed the change immediately. Daniel's expression tightened. He looked back toward the SUV and frowned. The conversation among the officers grew more intense. Marcus could not hear the words, but he could feel the shift. Something had changed. Traffic continued rushing past. Wind moved through the tall grass beyond the shoulder. The flashing lights reflected against the darkening highway. Marcus rested his hands on the steering wheel and waited. Whatever the officers believed they were uncovering, he knew it was not the truth. The only question now was how much longer it would take before anyone else realized it. The last traces of sunlight were beginning to disappear beyond the horizon when Officer Daniel Carter received another update through his radio. The flashing lights from 4 patrol vehicles painted the shoulder of Highway 17 in alternating shades of red and blue. Marcus Ellison remained seated inside his SUV, watching quietly as the officers moved back and forth between their vehicles. Nearly 40 minutes had passed since the stop began. The steady stream of traffic continued rushing by, but the evening now felt strangely isolated, as if the small section of highway occupied by the patrol cars existed in a world separate from everything else. Daniel walked back toward the driver's window carrying a different expression than before. The confidence was still there, but now it was mixed with frustration. Whatever information he had expected to find had not appeared. Marcus lowered the window. Completely. Cool air drifted through the vehicle. "Mr. Ellison," Daniel said, "step out of the vehicle for a moment." Marcus nodded without argument. He slowly opened the door and stepped onto the shoulder. The wind tugged lightly at his jacket. Gravel crunched beneath his shoes. The other officers watched closely. Marcus stood calmly beside the SUV with his hands visible. The flashing lights reflected across the side panels of the vehicle and across the faces of the officers. Daniel circled the SUV once more, occasionally glancing at Marcus as though waiting for some hidden detail to reveal itself. Nothing did. Marcus remained exactly the same man he had been at the beginning of the stop. Patient, respectful, calm. That seemed to bother Daniel more than any confrontation would have. "You understand why we have concerns?" Daniel said. Marcus looked at him. "Actually, officer, I do not." The answer was direct, but polite. Daniel folded his arms. Most people in this situation would be asking more questions. Marcus glanced toward the highway. And would that make the situation better? Daniel did not answer. For several seconds, only the sound of passing traffic filled the space between them. One of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably. Another checked his watch. The evening was growing darker. Headlights stretched across the roadway like streams of white light. Marcus looked toward his SUV. Through the passenger window, he could see the paper bag containing his dinner. He thought about how ordinary the day had been before the flashing lights appeared in his mirror. A meeting, paperwork, phone calls, plans for tomorrow. Nothing remarkable. Yet here he stood surrounded by officers who seemed determined to find a reason not to trust him. Daniel studied him carefully. "You seem very sure of yourself." Marcus offered a faint smile. "No, sir. I am simply sure of who I am." The statement lingered in the air. One of the officers glanced toward Daniel. Another looked away. Something about the answer felt different. Not defensive, not arrogant, just honest. Daniel was about to ask another question when a radio crackled sharply behind him. Every officer turned toward the sound. The message was brief, quiet, but the reaction was immediate. The younger officer looked up from the radio with a puzzled expression. Then he looked directly at Marcus. For the first time since the stop began, uncertainty appeared among the officers themselves. And standing beneath the flashing lights on the side of the highway, Marcus realized that whatever happened next was about to change everything. The younger officer lowered the radio slowly and looked from Officer Daniel Carter to Marcus Ellison. The uncertainty on his face was impossible to miss. For nearly an hour, the officers had controlled every part of the situation. Now, for the first time, they seemed unsure of what they were seeing. Daniel walked over immediately. "What was that?" he asked quietly. The younger officer hesitated before answering. Marcus could not hear the words, but he noticed Daniel's expression change. Not dramatically, just enough to reveal that something unexpected had entered the conversation. The evening air felt cooler now. The sun had disappeared completely, leaving only a band of fading orange light across the western horizon. Highway headlights streamed past in endless lines. Daniel looked back toward Marcus, then toward the SUV, then back at the officer holding the radio. "Verify it again," he said. The officer nodded and stepped away. Marcus remained standing beside his vehicle. He did not ask questions. He did not demand explanations. Years of experience had taught him that truth had a way of arriving in its own time. A gust of wind moved across the shoulder, carrying the scent of distant rain. Marcus slipped one hand into his jacket pocket and felt the edge of his wallet. Inside was the photograph he always carried. Without thinking, he removed the wallet and opened it. The picture showed a younger version of himself standing beside his wife and daughter many years earlier. All three were smiling. The image had become worn from time, but the memories remained sharp. For a brief moment, the noise of the highway seemed distant. He remembered family dinners, school events, long conversations about patience and character. His father had often told him that people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they hold power over someone else. At the time, Marcus had not fully understood the lesson. Standing beside the highway now, he understood it perfectly. Daniel returned a few minutes later. "What is that?" he asked, noticing the photograph. Marcus glanced down at it. A faint smile touched his face. "My family." Daniel looked at the image for a second before saying nothing. The answer seemed to remove some of the certainty from his posture. The younger officer approached again, carrying a tablet. He whispered something to Daniel. This time the conversation lasted longer. The other officers gradually moved closer. Their attention was no longer focused on Marcus alone. It was focused on information appearing on their screens. Marcus watched silently. The tension had changed shape. Earlier it had been directed toward him. Now it seemed to exist among the officers themselves. Daniel rubbed his forehead and looked toward the dark highway. The younger officer pointed at the screen again. Another radio transmission crackled through the night. This time, every officer listened carefully. Marcus closed his wallet and slipped it back into his pocket. He could not hear the details, but he could feel the shift happening. The assumptions that had guided the stop were beginning to crack. The confidence that had filled the roadside earlier was fading. And somewhere inside the growing silence, a single question was forming among the officers. Who exactly was Marcus Ellison? The night air settled over Highway 17 as the flashing patrol lights continued to pulse against the darkness. What had once felt like a routine stop now carried a different energy. Marcus Ellison stood quietly beside his SUV while the officers remained gathered near their vehicles. No one seemed eager to speak. No one seemed completely certain anymore. The highway continued its endless rhythm of passing headlights and distant engine noise. Above them, the first stars had begun appearing in the clear evening sky. Marcus looked toward the horizon and allowed himself a slow breath. The cool air felt different from the heat of the afternoon. It reminded him of evenings from years ago when he would sit on his porch with his father and listen to stories about patience, responsibility, and character. His father had always believed that a person's true nature revealed itself during moments of pressure. Standing beside the road now, Marcus found himself thinking about those conversations. Behind him, another radio transmission crackled through the silence. The younger officer listened carefully before handing the device to Daniel. Daniel stepped away from the group and listened alone. Marcus could not hear the words, but he noticed something unusual. Daniel was no longer looking at him with suspicion. He was looking at him with curiosity. It was a subtle change, but an important one. For nearly an hour, the officers had operated as though they already understood who Marcus was. Now they appeared to be questioning their own assumptions. Daniel lowered the radio slowly. The confidence that had defined him earlier seemed less certain now. He walked a few steps toward Marcus before stopping. Neither man spoke. Wind moved through the tall grass beyond the shoulder. Headlights streamed across the highway like rivers of white light. Finally, Daniel asked a different kind of question. "How long have you lived in this state?" Marcus looked at him for a moment before answering. "Most of my life." Daniel nodded. "And your work takes you around the country?" Marcus answered simply. "Sometimes." There was no challenge in the question, no accusation. For the first time, Daniel seemed interested in understanding rather than proving something. The younger officer approached, carrying the tablet again. He whispered several words into Daniel's ear. This time Daniel did not respond immediately. He stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he looked directly at Marcus. The silence that followed felt heavier than any conversation. One of the other officers exchanged a glance with his partner. Another removed his cap and rubbed the back of his neck. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Marcus could feel it. The uncertainty was no longer his. It belonged to them. He reached into his jacket pocket and briefly touched the edge of the family photograph inside his wallet. The simple gesture reminded him why remaining calm mattered. Anger could win an argument. Character could change a person. Somewhere behind the patrol vehicles, another radio call arrived. The younger officer listened, then looked up sharply. His eyes moved from the radio to Marcus, then back to Daniel. No one spoke for several seconds. Beneath the flashing lights and the darkening sky, one realization was quietly spreading through the group. They were getting closer to the truth. And the truth was nothing like what they had expected when the stop began. Officer Daniel Carter stared at the screen for several long seconds. The flashing lights continued reflecting across the highway, but nobody seemed to notice anymore. The younger officer remained beside him, waiting. Another officer stepped closer. Then another. The small group gathered around the tablet in complete silence. Marcus Ellison stood beside his SUV and watched without speaking. The cool night air moved gently across the shoulder of the road. Far above, the sky had darkened into deep shades of blue. Headlights streamed endlessly through the darkness. For nearly an hour, every question had been directed toward Marcus. Now all attention had shifted somewhere else. Daniel finally looked up from the screen. His eyes moved toward Marcus. There was no suspicion left in them, only confusion. "Mr. Ellison," he said carefully, "can you confirm your full legal name?" Marcus nodded. "Marcus Jonathan Ellison." The words seemed to settle over the group like a sudden weight. The younger officer lowered his gaze to the screen again. One of the other officers quietly exhaled. Daniel remained completely still. For the first time that evening, nobody spoke for several seconds. The sound of passing traffic filled the silence. Marcus noticed the reaction immediately. He had seen similar reactions before. Not often, but enough times to recognize them. Daniel looked at the tablet once more, then at Marcus, then back to the screen. "Marcus Jonathan Ellison," he repeated quietly. Marcus nodded. "That is correct." Another radio transmission crackled through the night. The younger officer answered quickly. His expression changed almost immediately. He turned toward Daniel. They confirmed it. Daniel took a slow breath. The confidence that had defined him earlier seemed to vanish altogether. One of the officers removed his cap and rubbed his forehead. Another stepped away from the group and stared out toward the highway. Marcus remained calm. He did not smile. He did not look satisfied. He simply waited. Daniel finally walked closer. This time his posture was different. The authority was still there, but something else had replaced the certainty. Respect was beginning to appear. "Mr. Ellison," he said, "I need to ask one more question." Marcus nodded. "Go ahead." Daniel hesitated. "Are you the same Marcus Ellison associated with the National Community Renewal Initiative?" The younger officer immediately looked up. The other officers did the same. The question hung in the air beneath the flashing lights. Marcus looked at Daniel for a moment before answering. "Yes." Nobody spoke. Even the officers seemed unsure how to respond. The name that had meant nothing to them an hour earlier suddenly carried enormous weight. Daniel looked away briefly and shook his head. Another radio transmission arrived. This time the voice on the other end sounded urgent. The younger officer listened carefully before handing the radio directly to Daniel. Daniel listened without speaking. His expression grew more serious with every passing second. When the transmission ended, he lowered the radio slowly and stared toward Marcus once again. Around them, the highway continued moving as though nothing had happened. But on that narrow stretch of roadside, everything had changed. The assumptions were gone. The certainty was gone. And standing beneath the glow of red and blue lights, the officers were beginning to understand that the man they had spent the evening questioning was not the man they had imagined at all. The silence lingered long after Marcus Ellison answered the question. The highway continued carrying thousands of strangers through the darkness, but on that narrow stretch of roadside, everything seemed suspended in place. Officer Daniel Carter stood motionless. Beneath the flashing lights, the radio remained in his hand. The voice he had just heard still echoed in his mind. Marcus watched him calmly. His expression had not changed. He carried himself with the same quiet confidence he had shown since the moment the stop began. One of the younger officers finally broke the silence. "That initiative helped my neighborhood," he said quietly. Nobody responded immediately. The statement seemed to deepen the realization spreading through the group. For years, the National Community Renewal Initiative had funded education programs, workforce training, youth mentorship, and housing projects across dozens of cities. Millions of dollars had reached struggling communities through partnerships that Marcus had helped build from the ground up. Yet standing beside the highway, he looked exactly the same as he had an hour earlier. An ordinary man in an older SUV with a bag of takeout food sitting on the passenger seat. Daniel slowly lowered the radio. "I did not know." Marcus offered a small nod. "Most people do not." The answer carried no bitterness, no accusation, just honesty. Wind moved across the shoulder, rustling the grass beyond the guardrail. The younger officers exchanged glances. Earlier in the evening, they had searched for reasons to doubt Marcus. Now they found themselves trying to understand how they had missed what was in front of them the entire time. Daniel looked toward the dark highway before speaking again. The person on the radio said you were in Washington 3 days ago. Marcus nodded. That is correct. Meeting with federal agencies? Marcus smiled faintly. Part of the job. Another silence followed. Daniel stared at the pavement beneath his feet. The assumptions that had guided every decision that evening now felt painfully obvious. Marcus had answered every question respectfully. He had never argued, never raised his voice, never tried to impress anyone. In fact, he had done everything possible to avoid discussing himself at all. The realization made Daniel even more uncomfortable. A pair of headlights swept across the scene before disappearing into the night. Marcus looked toward the horizon. Officer Carter. Daniel looked up immediately. Yes, sir. The response surprised even him. Marcus noticed it, but said nothing. Can I ask you something? Daniel nodded. Of course. Marcus glanced toward the line of patrol vehicles. If my name had not meant anything to your database, would we still be standing here? The question landed harder than any accusation ever could. Nobody answered. The younger officers looked away. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time all evening, he had no response. Marcus did not press further. He simply nodded once and looked back toward the highway. The flashing lights reflected across the side of his SUV. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly beyond the horizon. Daniel took a slow breath. He finally understood that the most important thing about Marcus Ellison was not his title, his reputation, or his connections. It was the simple fact that he deserved respect before any of those things were known. And standing beneath the glow of red and blue lights, that truth became impossible to ignore. The question Marcus Ellison asked lingered in the night long after the words were spoken. None of the officers attempted to answer it. The flashing lights continued reflecting across the highway, but their meaning felt different now. The authority they had projected earlier seemed smaller beneath the weight of the realization settling over them. Marcus stood quietly beside his SUV. He had no interest in humiliating anyone. He had no desire to make the moment more uncomfortable than it already was. The lesson had already arrived on its own. Officer Daniel Carter finally took a step forward. The wind carried the distant sound of traffic through the darkness. Mr. Ellison, he said carefully, I owe you an apology. Marcus looked at him calmly. Daniel continued. When this stop began, I believed I understood who you were. I made assumptions before I knew anything about you. That was wrong. The younger officers remained silent. Some stared at the pavement. Others looked toward the highway. Nobody seemed eager to escape responsibility. Marcus listened without interrupting. The sincerity in Daniel's voice was unmistakable. For the first time that evening, there was no authority in his tone. Only honesty. Marcus nodded slowly. I appreciate that. Daniel looked relieved, but Marcus was not finished. The problem is not that you were wrong about me. Daniel listened carefully. The problem is that you were ready to be wrong. The words settled heavily across the roadside. Nobody argued. Nobody disagreed. The truth of the statement was too obvious. Marcus glanced toward the line of patrol vehicles. Most people will never have a name that changes how they are treated. The younger officer lowered his eyes. Marcus continued. They deserve respect anyway. Another silence followed. This one felt different. Not uncomfortable. Reflective. Daniel looked toward the dark highway stretching beyond the flashing lights. He knew he would remember those words for a very long time. Eventually, Marcus opened the driver's door of his SUV. The interior light illuminated the takeout bag still resting on the passenger seat. He smiled faintly. My dinner is probably ruined by now. A few officers laughed softly. The tension that had dominated the evening finally began to disappear. Daniel stepped aside. You are free to go, sir. Marcus paused before entering the vehicle. Thank you, officer. He extended his hand. Daniel looked surprised for a moment before shaking it firmly. The gesture carried more meaning than either man needed to explain. Marcus climbed into the SUV and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the highway ahead. Before pulling away, he looked once more through the open window. Have a safe night, gentlemen. Then he merged onto the road and disappeared into the flow of traffic. The taillights grew smaller and smaller until they vanished completely into the darkness. The officers remained standing on the shoulder for several seconds after he left. Nobody spoke. The highway continued carrying strangers home beneath a sky filled with stars. Daniel finally looked down the empty road and exhaled slowly. The flashing lights reflected across his uniform one final time. Earlier that evening, he had believed he was evaluating a stranger. Now he understood that the evening had been evaluating him. Above the highway, the night stretched quietly across the horizon. The patrol vehicles eventually pulled away. The shoulder became empty once more. But somewhere ahead, Marcus continued driving home. And somewhere behind him, a lesson about dignity, assumptions, and respect remained standing beneath the fading lights long after everyone else had gone.